working with gradients in InDesign. Now, many of you have most likely worked with gradients in Photoshop and Illustrator, so you are already familiar with what a gradient is. A gradient is a graduated blend from one color to another, and you have to have two or more colors. So you have a starting color and you have an ending color, and then however many color stops in between. So let's go ahead and make a new gradient swatch. Now I have my color panel open and my swatches panel. I'm going to go and open my gradient panel as well, which happens to be under color. So window menu, color, gradient. All right, so it may have just a little piece showing. Make sure that you show the options here. So I'm going to work with both gradient panel and swatches panel, but we're going to start in the swatches panel. So in the swatches panel, I go to the options menu here and choose to select new gradient swatch. So when I click that, my new gradient swatch dialog box opens. I can enter a name in here if I would like, and it's a good idea always to start naming these very descriptively, just as I did, so that you know what gradient, you know which is which when you have a list of them in there. And the second piece here, I'm able to define my type. In InDesign, we're only offered two options, linear or radial. So linear basically is with the line, straight lines, graduated blend of color. Radial radiates out from the center, so it's a series of concentric circles that go out. So depending on the type that you'd like, I'll just stick with linear. And then what we have is our gradient ramp down here. So my gradient ramp allows me to change initially my starting and my ending color, and I can choose that by using colors that I see here in swatches. I can go to my sliders if I'd like here as well, and so I can choose whatever color I want. Let's just go back to swatches here, and we'll just do a red to a green. Okay, so there it is. Now if I wanted to add more gradient stops, I just need to click, just like we do in other programs, where I can click to add more colors if I so desire. If I've added too many and I want to get rid of them, I drag them out. My diamond indicates my midpoint. So this is where it's at a 50-50. And I can change that midpoint. You see how my location changes? So in this case, up and around 70%, that's where I have 50% of red and 50% of green. All right, so if I want to keep this gradient, then I click Add. And Add will add it to my swatches. If I want to do another one now, I can just click and drag and add a second one. Okay, and then I'm done. So those are two ways that I can add a gradient via my swatches panel. Now I also can create it with my gradient panel over here, and I can just choose again which one I want and my colors. Now the colors I'm able to select from my swatches, but notice that when I click over here I just lost it. So what I need to do is actually hold down my Alt or my Option key. Make sure you have one of your stops selected and click on that color. So when I hold down Alt or my Option, it will update that color of the stop that I have selected so that I can then change my gradient. And if I say I want this radial, then I can click and drag that into my swatches panel, and now I have some defined gradients. So when I apply these gradients, I can have my object selected. Let's just go ahead and select this first box, and I click on my gradient and it applies. Now remember that you need to make sure you're showing all swatches here, because if you only have color swatches, you're not going to see your gradients. On the same side, you can show just your gradients if you're wanting just to work with gradients. Good idea just to show all. So I can apply it that way. I can click and drag to put them in a box as well. Now I also have a way that I can edit these using my tools. So I have a gradient swatch tool, and I also have a gradient feather tool. So I'm going to select this object right here, click on my gradient swatch tool, have my fill be one of my swatches here, and then click and drag, and you can see that I can change both the length. I can drag outside of my container, or I can drag small inside. So this works maybe what you are familiar with in, say, Illustrator. Okay. The feather tool is basically the same as my gradient tool. However, it just has a softer progression of color. So if I click and drag with this, you can just see it's a little bit softer. It's not as harsh. So if you wanted a softer effect. A couple other tools that are worth pointing out at this point in time. One is the eyedropper tool. So let's just go back to a basic fill and stroke here. If I wanted to copy the attributes of this box, or at least pick them up, I can use my eyedropper tool. So the eyedropper samples the color that are placed, and then it will allow me to paint. So I can sample up and I can paint, which is really kind of nice because if I hold it in there, I'm able to sample it up. Hold down my Alt key, sample up again, and I can paint. So I'm allowed a quick way to sample attributes and apply them. One other just key thing worth noting, and I know this is more of an advanced feature, but just wanted to point it out. When you send things to print, you may have what's called an overprint colors. Now let's just put a cyan in these, and let's just say these overlap. I'll delete this, and you can see the order is kind of interesting, and this actually has a softened effect, which might be interesting what happens here. So there's a little bit of a gradient, it looks like, applied on this one. So what we have, basically, if I select, say, let's select this object here. If I go to Window, and I go to Output, and I go to Attributes. What this is tells me about overprint fill, overprint stroke. So what overprinting does is if this object, this pink, is overlapping this blue, there might be a mixture when overprinting. So if I overprint it, then the magenta color object mixes with the blue underneath to create a mixture of color in that overlapping area. Okay, so this is just a technique that allows us to set the color of the object or to mix with colors underneath of it. When I turn it off, if it's not checked, then what will happen is this color, magenta, will what we call knock out the blue, and it prints as true magenta. So when we print this, even though blue is behind it, there won't be blue, it'll knock it out. Okay, so if I have overprint on this one, and maybe on this one, and then what we can do is view and look for the overprint preview, and you can see how now those blend in the areas that I defined them to overprint. So that's something to think about as you head to print. It's different than digital world, that you have to think of how these inks are blending together. So overprint versus knockout, something to think about with those attributes.